ended up spending 8 years with the Tribune and covering stories. But Story Keeper, so it involves a lot of the stories that I freelanced as well as did later with this little magazine called the Stew Magazine that Craig Smith kind of got going in that direction of having a historical piece once a month. The person on the cover of the Story Keeper's book is Lucy Dag Dester-Sulin. Lucy actually was one of the big inspirations for me. I was living in a tent at Clean that winter of 1982, I think it was, or 3. We were living in a cabin tent at Thelma Petrie's place, and Lucy showed up on horseback, and she was going to trade some fur and buy some flour from Thelma Petrie's little store. And I didn't have a camera. I wrote a story about it. I sent it to Diana at the Tribune, but so then a few weeks later, I asked Diana, you don't happen to have a camera in the old Tribune back room somewhere? And she found one for me, some camera that the light meter didn't work, but she says, just frame your images and you'll probably get something. And so she gave me a camera and I started, but it was Lucy that inspired me because there's a 70-something-year-old woman who shows up on horseback in the middle of winter to buy some stuff at the store, and I thought that deserved a photograph. So that was my career beginning with the Tribune, and then in 2001, Angie Mindus, who's the editor there now, she was a reporter, and she wanted to take a year off and travel, and so I took her job for 6 months. And by the time she got back, the Tribune couldn't live without me. And so I got to stay. I became the summer student, and then Angie went on mat leave. So I ended up spending 8 years with the Tribune and covering stories. I was in Toronto 50 years ago, 1973, and I read an article about this woman, Chi-Wit. And Chi-Wit was a Chilcotin woman who lived outside for 50 years under a tree, and somehow she was allowed to exist there. People supported her as much as they could, and I figured, doggone it, the Chilcotin sounds like a really interesting place to go visit and maybe live. And as it turns out, I ended up living there for 24 years in the Chilcotin, and I've been in the Cariboo Chilcotin for 50 years. So Chi-Wit, and I ended up writing this book in 1995. It was published. I started researching it in 1988, and basically went around and interviewed all the people that knew her and would have, had experience with her and stories to tell. I never met her personally. I didn't need to. She was my muse. She lived on the other side of the hills there. So I was a street worker and a court worker, and I helped people through the system get the stuff they deserved and needed. And in the process, I met the indigenous First Nations people living on the street. And they had an acronym, a nickname called the Troopers. And there's a lot of theories where the name Troopers came from. I think it was named by an indigenous person from Alkali, from Esquet, because they all went together. They go down the alley, and yes, they had addiction issues with alcohol, and for many years I wasn't comfortable writing about that just because it was too stereotypical. Thunderbird, he was one of the leading troopers, and I had this job for about a year as working out of the Friendship Center, and it was Christmas time, 1975, and I went to my office in the Friendship Center, and there was Bert pounding on the door because that was the one warm place they could go to get a cup of coffee and get out of the, winter in the Cariboo is 10, 20, 30 below sometimes. It was a cold day, and Bert wanted to get out of the cold weather, and it was locked. It was Christmas holidays. So I was ready to actually change vocations. They wanted to make me into a civil servant, and I just bought a trap line, and I didn't want to become a civil servant. And so I ended up saying, hey, Bert, let's go cut some firewood. And so I quit my job and started cutting firewood with the troopers. And the miracle is that you find friendship and camaraderie, And that's what I discovered with the troopers. And from there on, I introduced the troopers to my communal friends who lived down the Horsefly Road, and they started working with the commune, doing the stuff they loved to do. They cut hay with horses, they build fences, and they got to socialize and just hang out and be part of the commune. Well, one of the troopers in Williams Lake was this fellow named Donald Lulua, and Donald would take off once in a while, and he'd be gone from town for 2 or 3 weeks. And I always wondered, where in the heck did Donald go? And he'd say, well, I got to go help my mother. And so, okay, fine. And so he'd go out and he'd be gone, and then he'd show up again, and he'd be back into the groove with us in town here. So in '77, I moved out to the Chilcotin, out to Tatlow Lake, where my trap line was. And I bumped into Donald at an event, at a funeral or some event, and he introduced me to his mother and his dad and his relatives and his friends out at Nimpo Lake. And from there, I got to know them as my neighbors. They were my neighbors. My trap line was 40 miles into the mountains from Tatlow Lake down the West Branch, and Donald and Emily had several camps, one at Tatlow Lake, one at a place called Quitsine, and another place down at Henry's Crossing, where the salmon come in, and they would have their salmon drying racks and everything. A friend says, hey, we got an archaeologist friend that's going to come and do some flint napping at Donald and Emily's camp. So this was 1989, and my friend David Friesen is an archaeologist. He got some obsidian from Anaheim Peak, and he started whacking it, or having this event and making arrowheads and showing the kids, my kids and my friends' kids. And at the end of the day, Donald says, well, we'll set the net. So they got their little canoe, and it's dark by this time. I had my little canoe, and I went out, and I had my camera, and I click, 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 and it wasn't an automatic or anything, but I got a couple of in-focus photos of Emily setting her net. So it's a very classic picture for me. And then the next day, I came back, and Donald harvested the fish, and there was trout in there and rainbows and things like that, and a couple of suckers and different stuff, and they used everything. So that's how I got to know them. They lived in the same footprint in Tatlaco Valley as the settlers did, and it was a very interesting community of live and let live and respect for each other. Everybody would give Donald and Emily a ride, like they didn't own a vehicle. So if they'd just stand beside the road, somebody'd give them a ride home, or a ride to Anaheim Lake, or a ride to Namaya Valley, wherever they happened to want to go. One day Donald says, hey, you want to see a pit house? And I said, what? Yeah, he says, there's a pit house. I said, it's got wood on it still? He says, yeah. Emily's brother made a pit house for their grandfather way back in the early 1900s, and so we drove out there toward Henry's Crossing, and he showed me where this thing was, and it was square in shape, but covered with dirt. And the old Bab stick, Emily's grandfather, that's how the way of life that they liked. That was their old tradition. And there was a lot of written material about Ralph Edwards. He was like a back to the lander from 1911. So he was a cultural hero in the Cariboo Chilcotin Bella Coola. He got his airplane. He used to fly his airplane around and deliver produce from their farm to different fish camps and logging camps. His daughter Trudy actually was the first pilot in the family, and it was Trudy that went down and got her pilot's license and bought an airplane, went down to the Grand Coulee Dam and bought an airplane there and flew it back to Lonesome Lake. Each chapter in Storykeepers, I had to go back to the family, because most of the people I wrote about are long gone, so I had to go back to the family and get an update, bring it to the present day.